My name is Haley, and I am 31 years old working as a compliance analyst at a mid-sized software company where I usually blend into the background. That changed when I accidentally became the central figure in a corporate drama involving a $170 million acquisition. Nobody noticed the quiet woman documenting everything, especially not our arrogant CTO who dismissed me daily. He never imagined I would discover the secret that would bring his empire crashing down. If you are watching this from your office cubicle wondering if your work matters, subscribe now because what happened next showed me that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds all the power. Let me take you back to where it all began. Novagen Software was a promising startup with cutting-edge artificial intelligence technology when I joined 3 years ago. We had just secured our Series B funding and the office still had that energetic startup vibe where everyone wore multiple hats and genuinely cared about building something great. I was hired to establish compliance protocols as the company scaled. My job involved ensuring we followed regulations, managing intellectual property documentation, and creating frameworks to protect our innovations. It was detail-oriented work that few people understood or appreciated, but I took pride in doing it well. The key players in this story were quite the cast of characters. Jessica Bennett was our CEO and founder, a brilliant visionary who had built Novagen from a concept scribbled on napkins in her apartment to a company valued at over $100 million. She had technical knowledge, but her real strength was in business strategy and investor relations. Jessica always treated me with respect, but she was increasingly removed from day-to-day operations as the company grew. Then there was Marcus Reynolds, our Chief Technology Officer. He joined about a year before me, bringing impressive credentials from larger tech companies. Marcus was the type who commanded attention when he entered a room. He dressed impeccably in designer clothes, dropped names of famous tech leaders he claimed to know personally, and had a way of making complex technical concepts sound simple to investors. The developers respected his technical skills, but behind closed doors, many complained about his management style and tendency to take credit for their work. My direct supervisor, Taylor Wilson, was a decent person trapped in middle management. Taylor genuinely wanted to support me, but lacked the political capital to challenge executive decisions. Whenever I raised concerns, Taylor would listen sympathetically but ultimately advise me to focus on my specific responsibilities and not rock the boat. Rachel Kim worked in legal and became my closest ally at Novagen. She had been there since the early days and saw how the culture was changing. Over lunch one day, about 6 months after I started, she warned me, "This place is different now. When we were small, everyone looked out for each other. Now it is all about impressing investors and pumping up our valuation for an exit." Those words proved prophetic. As Novagen grew from 30 employees to over 100, I noticed the shift Rachel described. The collaborative atmosphere gave way to internal competition. New executives from larger companies brought corporate politics with them. People became protective of their projects, less willing to help others, and more concerned with claiming credit. Everything accelerated when Jessica announced during an all-hands meeting that tech giant Apex Solutions was interested in acquiring us. The news sent excitement rippling through the company. A $170 million acquisition meant potential payouts for everyone with equity, impressive job titles at a major tech player, and validation that our work mattered. I remember looking around the room during that announcement. Most faces showed excitement and relief. A few of the early employees exchanged concerned glances, and Rachel caught my eye with a subtle headshake. Marcus stood near Jessica, practically glowing with self-satisfaction, as if the acquisition interest was entirely due to his brilliance. For the next few weeks, the office buzzed with acquisition talk. People speculated about their potential payouts, updated their resumes, and discussed which Apex projects they hoped to join. I kept my head down, focusing on organizing our intellectual property documentation as requested by Jessica. The acquisition team would need clear proof that we owned all our technology free and clear. That was when the first troubling sign appeared. Marcus and the new legal director circulated an updated employment agreement that everyone was required to sign. The most concerning section expanded the company ownership claims over employee intellectual property. "This seems excessive," I told Rachel after reviewing it. "They are claiming ownership of anything we create, even on our own time, with our own equipment, regardless of whether it relates to company business." Rachel nodded grimly. That language would never hold up in court in California, but they are hoping most employees will not know that. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach as I watched eager employees sign without reading, dreaming of acquisition bonuses. Something did not feel right, but I could not put my finger on what exactly bothered me beyond the obviously overreaching terms. At that point, I still believed in the company. I convinced myself this aggressive approach to intellectual property was just standard practice during acquisitions. I told myself I was being paranoid when I noticed Marcus watching me particularly closely when the agreements were distributed, as if gauging my reaction. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Apex representatives began appearing regularly in our office for meetings. Conference rooms were constantly booked for due diligence sessions. Everyone was working overtime to prepare documentation, polish products, and present the company in the best possible light. I was assigned to work with the compliance team, gathering and organizing all our intellectual property records. The more I dug into our code repositories and documentation, the more questions emerged. There were sections of our core platform with minimal documentation about their origins. When I asked technical leads about these areas, they redirected me to Marcus, who was too busy for my questions. "Just compile what we have," he told me dismissively when I finally cornered him in the hallway. "Stop looking for problems where there are none. This deal is happening with or without your approval." His condescending tone stung, but it was his dismissiveness toward proper compliance that truly alarmed me. In my experience, people who discouraged thorough documentation usually had something to hide. I began keeping more detailed notes of my own separately from the official documentation. By this point, the once collaborative atmosphere at Novagen had completely transformed. People worked behind closed doors. Rumors spread about who would be retained after the acquisition and who would be let go. Early employees who had been friends now competed to prove their value to the acquiring company. In the midst of this changing landscape, I became increasingly isolated. My questions about documentation and compliance earned me a reputation as a troublemaker. Marcus started excluding me from meetings where I should have been present. People stopped talking when I entered the break room. Only Rachel still treated me normally, but even she seemed guarded, afraid of being associated too closely with someone who had apparently fallen out of favor with leadership. It was in this atmosphere of tension and secrecy that the infamous intellectual property meeting took place, a scene that would ultimately set in motion everything that followed. The intellectual property policy meeting was mandatory for all employees. Marcus scheduled it late on a Friday afternoon, which already felt calculated. The timing ensured people would be tired and less likely to ask challenging questions. The large conference room was packed with people standing along the walls. I arrived early to secure a seat with a good view, my notebook ready. Marcus stood at the front with our newly hired legal director, Amanda Peters, whom nobody knew well yet. Jessica was notably absent, which struck me as odd for such an important company policy discussion. "Thanks for coming, everyone." Marcus began, flashing his practiced smile. "As we move forward with the exciting acquisition process, Apex has requested that we formalize and strengthen our intellectual property protections. This is standard procedure, nothing to worry about." He nodded to Amanda, who distributed printed copies of the new policy while Marcus continued. "The key update is a comprehensive ownership clause. To put it simply, Novagen needs to own everything you create, whether during work hours or on your own time. This protects our core business and makes us more valuable to Apex." The room remained silent as people skimmed the document. I was already on my second reading, highlighting concerning sections, when Ben Collins from the development team raised his hand. "This says you claim ownership of anything we create, even on weekends, using our own equipment, even if it has nothing to do with Novagen products." Ben said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "That cannot be legal." Marcus smiled condescendingly. "Actually, it is perfectly legal when you sign the agreement. Think of it this way. You are being well compensated, and this acquisition will add significant value to your equity. Consider this a small price to pay for that upside." Another developer, Alicia Tang, spoke up. "But I teach coding classes on weekends and create educational materials. Does this mean Novagen now owns my teaching curriculum?" "Yes, technically," Amanda answered before Marcus could, "but we are not interested in educational materials. We just need to ensure that any potentially valuable innovations belong to the company." The room grew tense as more questions emerged. What about open source contributions? Personal projects started before joining Novagen, creative writing or music created after hours. Marcus grew visibly impatient with each question. Finally, when Jamie Foster, one of our senior engineers, asked about his side project, a volunteer coding platform for teaching kids in underserved communities, Marcus snapped. Look, this is not complicated, he said, his voice rising. We own all your code, even your side projects. This is non-negotiable if you want to remain with the company through the acquisition. He paused, scanning the room with a smirk. If anyone cannot live with that, the door is right there. Plenty of developers would kill for your positions. The room fell silent. I watched as people exchanged glances, some resigned, others angry, but all recognizing the implicit threat. No one wanted to jeopardize their acquisition payout by being labeled difficult. I remained quiet during the meeting, observing and taking notes. As a compliance analyst, I knew that overly broad intellectual property claims were often unenforceable, especially in California, where our headquarters was located. But I also knew that many employees would not have the resources to challenge such policies in court if it came to that. After the meeting, clusters of employees gathered in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones. I overheard snippets of conversations about whether the policy would really be enforced, whether it was worth fighting, whether lawyers should be consulted. That evening, I stayed late researching intellectual property laws in our state. As I suspected, several aspects of the new policy were legally questionable. California Labor Code Section 2870 specifically protected employee inventions developed entirely on their own time, using their own equipment, unrelated to the employer business. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with Taylor to discuss my findings. I brought printouts of relevant laws and cases, hoping my thorough preparation would make Taylor take my concerns seriously. I understand your concerns, Haley, Taylor said after listening to my presentation. And between us, I agree that this policy overreaches. But this comes straight from Marcus and has Jessica approval. My hands are tied. But should not our legal team be advising against policies that would not hold up in court? I pressed. Taylor sighed. Amanda was personally selected by Marcus. She represents the company interests, not individual employees. And right now, the company interest is getting this acquisition done with minimum complications. I left the meeting frustrated but not surprised. Over the next few days, I tried to raise my concerns through proper channels, emailing Amanda with specific questions about the policy legality and suggesting revisions that would protect the company while respecting employee rights. My emails went unanswered. Instead, I was summoned to a meeting with Marcus. I understand you have been questioning the new IP policy, he said without preamble when I entered his office. His tone was ice cold. I have some concerns about its enforceability under state law, I replied, trying to maintain a professional tone. I am just trying to protect the company from potential future litigation. Marcus leaned forward, his expression hardening. Your job is not to question policies, but to implement them. This kind of behavior is being noticed, Haley. And not in a good way. The acquisition is happening, and we need team players, not obstacles. The threat was unmistakable. I left his office shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. That night, I updated my resume, wondering if I should start looking for a new job before the acquisition. The following weeks were increasingly uncomfortable. I was excluded from meetings relevant to my role. Colleagues became distant, afraid to be seen as too friendly with me. Tasks that should have come to me were reassigned to others. Rachel tried to warn me during a whispered conversation by the coffee machine. Marcus is telling people you are trying to sabotage the acquisition because you are jealous you do not have enough equity. Be careful, Haley. I was stunned by the manipulation. That is absolutely not true. I am trying to ensure we follow proper compliance procedures. Rachel squeezed my arm sympathetically. I know that, but people believe what they want to believe, especially when millions of dollars are at stake. The final blow came when Jessica herself called me into her office. I had always respected her and hoped she might listen to my concerns. Instead, she got straight to the point. Haley, I value the work you do here, but several people have expressed concerns about your attitude toward the acquisition. Jessica, I fully support the acquisition, I replied earnestly. I just want to make sure we do it right with proper compliance and documentation. She studied me for a moment. I understand, but we need to trust our leadership team during this critical time. Marcus has successfully guided several companies through acquisitions. He knows what he is doing. She paused. I need you to be a team player right now. Can you do that? I nodded, recognizing defeat. Yes, I can. Good, she said with visible relief. The Apex team will be here next week for final negotiations. Let us all put our best foot forward. As I left her office, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Disappointment that Jessica had bought into Marcus' narrative, frustration at being silenced, but also a growing determination to continue doing my job properly regardless of the consequences. What I did not realize then was that the real story was just beginning to unfold. In my efforts to properly document our intellectual property, I was about to stumble upon information that would change everything. 2 nights before the final acquisition meeting, I was alone in the office working late to complete the compliance documentation. Most employees had left hours ago, eager to prepare for the celebration that would surely follow the deal signing. The office was eerily quiet, just the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional ping of late-night emails. I had been systematically reviewing all our technology assets, ensuring everything was properly documented and owned by Novagen. Despite being sidelined from many acquisition meetings, I was determined to do my job thoroughly. If nothing else, I wanted to leave knowing I had maintained my professional standards. Around 11:30, I was deep in the archives of our code repository, cross-referencing contribution logs with employment records, a tedious but necessary process to verify ownership. Most of our code was properly attributed to current or former Novagen employees, with clear documentation of when contractors had been used. Then I noticed something odd. A significant portion of our core authentication framework, the security layer that protected our entire platform, had been committed in a single massive update by Marcus shortly after he joined the company. This was unusual. Most code developed internally would show a progression of commits, revisions, and contributions from multiple team members. Curious, I dug deeper into the logs. According to the timestamp, Marcus had uploaded this code at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, just 3 weeks after joining Novagen. The commit message was vague, implementing robust authentication framework as discussed. My compliance instincts were on high alert. I pulled up Marcus' employment agreement and reviewed the section about prior intellectual property. Like all employees, he had been required to disclose any relevant IP he brought with him. His form stated none in that section. I decided to examine the code itself, though my technical skills were limited. Even to my untrained eye, the authentication framework seemed unusually polished for something supposedly developed from scratch in just 3 weeks. The comments within the code were sparse, but included a few references to implementation details that did not quite match our system architecture. On a hunch, I accessed our HR files, looking for information about Marcus' previous employment. Before Novagen, he had worked at SecureStack, a cybersecurity company that had been acquired by a larger firm 2 years earlier. I made a note to research SecureStack products when I got home. As I continued searching, I discovered something even more concerning. In a forgotten folder on our shared drive, I found early emails between Marcus and Jessica from his hiring period. In one exchange, Jessica had specifically asked if Marcus could bring improved security features to our platform. His response was carefully worded. I have extensive experience with advanced authentication systems and can implement something similar for Novagen. The word similar caught my attention. It suggested he was planning to recreate something he had worked on before rather than transfer existing code, which would have been illegal without proper rights. It was nearly 1 a.m. when I made the critical discovery. While searching for documentation related to our licensing agreements, I found an old external hard drive in the back of a supply cabinet. It was labeled simply Backup 2019, the year Marcus joined. I connected the drive to my computer and found it contained development materials from our early platform versions. Among these files was a folder labeled Auth Framework, reference containing what appeared to be research materials. Inside was a PDF of a SecureStack technical white paper describing their proprietary authentication system in detail. More damning, there was a series of comparison documents showing SecureStack code snippets alongside Novagen implementations. The similarities were striking even to my non-technical eye. Variable names had been changed, comments removed, and some functions restructured, but the core logic appeared nearly identical. My heart was pounding. If what I was seeing was accurate, Marcus had essentially copied SecureStack proprietary code and implemented it as Novagan technology. This was not just an ethical violation, it was potentially illegal copyright infringement that could invalidate our core IP. I stayed in the office until 3 in the morning, meticulously documenting everything I had found. I made copies of the critical files, took screenshots of the code repositories, and archived the relevant emails. I saved everything to an encrypted folder on my personal cloud storage, then made a backup on a small USB drive I kept on my keychain. If this was as serious as I thought, I needed to protect the evidence. The next day I arrived at work exhausted but determined. I needed advice but had to be careful who I trusted. During lunch, I found Rachel alone in the break room. Hypothetically, I began keeping my voice low. If you discovered that company intellectual property might not be legitimately owned, what would you do? Rachel glanced around to make sure we were alone. Hypothetically, that could potentially derail an acquisition if the target company IP is central to the valuation. She studied my face. Haley, what did you find? I cannot say specifically, I replied, but I need to decide whether to bring it up before the acquisition concludes. That is a career-defining decision, Rachel warned. If you are wrong, or even if you are right, but cannot prove it conclusively, you will be labeled a troublemaker who tanked a $170 million deal. Are you absolutely certain about whatever you found? Her question haunted me that night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Was I certain enough to potentially derail an acquisition that everyone at the company was counting on? Would I be able to live with myself if I stayed silent knowing what I knew? I reviewed the evidence again on my laptop, going through each document methodically. The more I examined it, the more convinced I became that Marcus had inappropriately used his knowledge and code from SecureStack. The question was whether he had legal rights to that code that I was unaware of, perhaps through some arrangement with his former employer. After hours of deliberation, I decided I needed to give Marcus a chance to explain before taking further action. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation I had overlooked. Perhaps he had obtained permission from SecureStack that wasn't documented in our files. I also made one more crucial decision. I prepared a detailed report of my findings, encrypted it, and scheduled an email to be sent to Jessica and our board of directors if I did not cancel it within 24 hours. It was an insurance policy of sorts, ensuring the information would come to light even if I was suddenly fired or silenced. With everything in place, I tried to get a few hours of sleep before what I knew would be one of the most challenging days of my professional life. Tomorrow, I would confront Marcus with my findings and then decide whether to take the information to Jessica before the Apex team arrived. What I could not have anticipated was how quickly things would escalate and how a quiet compliance analyst like me would soon find herself at the center of a corporate drama that would reshape everyone's futures. The morning of the confrontation, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to catch Marcus before his calendar filled with acquisition meetings. My hands trembled slightly as I prepared a cup of coffee, rehearsing what I would say. I spotted him entering his office around 7:30 and gave him a few minutes to settle in before knocking on his door. Haley, he said with surprise when I entered. What can I do for you? His tone was impatient, making it clear this was an unwelcome interruption. I need to discuss something important regarding our intellectual property documentation, I said, closing the door behind me. Can it wait? The Apex team will be here in a few hours and I have preparations to complete. Actually, it concerns the acquisition directly, I replied, maintaining eye contact despite my racing heart. It is about our authentication framework. Something flickered across his face, a momentary tension, before his expression returned to mild annoyance. What about it? I took a deep breath. While completing the compliance review, I found evidence suggesting the framework may incorporate code from SecureStack, your previous employer. I wanted to check if there is documentation of permission to use that code that I might have missed. Marcus' face hardened. That is a serious accusation, Haley. The authentication framework was developed here at Novagan by our team under my direction. I understand that is the official position, I said carefully. But I found comparison documents showing striking similarities between SecureStack code and our implementation. I also noticed you committed the entire framework in a single update shortly after joining, which is unusual for original development. His eyes narrowed. You have been snooping through old repositories and files that have nothing to do with your compliance role. Actually verifying the provenance of our intellectual property is exactly my role. I countered, surprised by my own steadiness. All I am asking is whether there is documentation of permission from SecureStack that would resolve this issue. Marcus stood abruptly. There is no issue to resolve. You are clearly out of your depth technically and making connections that do not exist. This sounds like a desperate attempt to make yourself relevant to an acquisition process that does not involve you. I had expected defensiveness, but the personal attack still stung. This is not personal, Marcus. I am trying to protect Novagen. If there is any question about our IP ownership, Apex needs to know before the acquisition concludes. Otherwise, they could have grounds for legal action against us later. Enough, he snapped. You have wasted enough of my time with this nonsense. I suggest you focus on your actual responsibilities and leave technical matters to those qualified to understand them. He moved toward the door. And Haley, if you disrupt this acquisition with unfounded accusations, I will personally ensure you never work in this industry again. Do I make myself clear? The threat hung in the air between us. I nodded silently and left his office, my mind racing. His reaction had only strengthened my suspicions. A person with nothing to hide would have calmly explained why my concerns were unfounded, not resorted to threats. Back at my desk, I considered my options. The acquisition team from Apex would arrive at 11 for the final meeting. Jessica would be tied up in preparations until then. If I went to her now with accusations against her trusted CTO, without giving her time to process the information, she might dismiss my concerns as Marcus had. After careful consideration, I wrote a brief note. Jessica, I have discovered concerning information about our authentication framework that may impact the acquisition. Evidence suggests it contains code from SecureStack. I have documentation to support this. Please talk to me before finalizing anything with Apex. Haley. I sealed the note in an envelope and left it with her assistant, asking that it be given to Jessica as soon as possible. Then I returned to my desk to prepare the documentation, organizing everything for clear presentation if I was given the chance to explain. The morning passed in a blur of anxiety. I kept expecting security to appear at my desk to escort me out, but nothing happened. At 10:30, people began gathering for the acquisition meeting. I watched from my cubicle as executives I rarely saw in person arrived in their finest business attire, converging on the main conference room. At 10:45, Jessica's assistant appeared at my desk. Jessica would like you to join the acquisition meeting. Bring your laptop. My heart leaped to my throat. Had she read my note? Was this an opportunity to present my findings, or was I being set up for public humiliation? I gathered my materials with shaking hands and followed the assistant to the conference room. Inside, the long table was surrounded by people in suits. Jessica sat at one end with the Apex CEO at the other. Marcus was seated at Jessica's right, and he visibly stiffened when I entered. Jessica gave me a tight smile. Haley, please take a seat. The Apex team has some questions about our compliance documentation, and I mentioned you are our expert in that area. There was an empty chair midway down the table. I sat and opened my laptop, still unsure what was happening. Had Jessica seen my note? Or was my presence here unrelated? The next 30 minutes proceeded with standard acquisition discussions. Executives from both companies reviewed the terms of the agreement, discussed integration plans, and exchanged pleasantries about the bright future ahead. I remained silent, wondering why I had been included. Then the Apex legal counsel, a sharp-featured woman named Diana Fletcher, turned her attention to intellectual property matters. Before we proceed to signing, we need final confirmation that all intellectual property included in the acquisition is legitimately owned by Novagen with no outstanding claims or licensing issues. Jessica nodded confidently. Absolutely. We have comprehensive documentation of all our IP, and our technical assets are either developed in-house or properly licensed from third parties. Diana looked at Marcus. As CTO, can you personally attest that all core technologies, particularly those central to product functionality, were either developed by Novagen employees or properly acquired? Marcus smiled smoothly, without question. I have overseen all significant technical developments since joining the company, and I can assure you that everything is original Novigan intellectual property or properly licensed. I felt a surge of indignation at his blatant lie. My fingers hovered over my keyboard, wondering if I should speak up or remain silent. Diana continued, and specifically regarding the authentication framework which our technical team has identified as a key security component we are acquiring. Can you confirm its provenance? Before Marcus could answer, Jessica glanced in my direction. Actually, our compliance analyst, Haley, has been reviewing all our IP documentation. Haley, would you like to address this question? All eyes turned to me. Marcus shot me a warning glare, but Jessica's expression was unreadable. This was the moment of truth, the opportunity I had hoped for yet dreaded. I cleared my throat. Thank you, Jessica. During my compliance review, I identified some concerns regarding the authentication framework that I feel obligated to share. I turned to address the room. My investigation suggests that portions of the framework may have been derived from proprietary technology belonging to SecureStack where Marcus worked previously. A tense silence fell over the room. Marcus' face flushed with anger, but he remained silent as I continued. I have compiled documentation showing the similarities between SecureStack code and our implementation, along with the timeline of when this code was introduced to our repositories. I have found no evidence that Novagan has licensing rights to this technology. I opened the files on my laptop and turned the screen toward Diana. Here are side-by-side comparisons of code segments. While variable names have been changed, the underlying architecture and algorithms appear nearly identical. Diana examined the screen intently, then looked up at her technical colleague, who nodded in confirmation. May I? The Apex CEO asked, gesturing toward my laptop. I passed it down the table to him. After reviewing the documents, he signaled to his assistant, who handed him a folder. From it, he extracted a single document and slid it across the table toward Jessica. This might be relevant to the discussion. Jessica took the document, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as she read it. Her smile froze, and the color drained from her face. She slowly turned to Marcus and whispered, "Explain this. Now." Marcus started to protest, but the Apex CEO interrupted. That document is a confidential summary of ongoing litigation between SecureStack and their former employee, Marcus Reynolds, regarding alleged theft of proprietary code. We became aware of this situation during our due diligence, but wanted to see if Novigan would disclose it voluntarily. All eyes turned to Marcus, whose confident demeanor had completely collapsed. The room erupted into a flurry of whispered conversations and shocked expressions. As I sat there watching the chaos unfold, I realized that my quiet persistence had brought a critical truth to light. A truth that would fundamentally change the acquisition and perhaps the future of Novagan itself. The conference room descended into controlled chaos. Jessica called for a 15-minute recess, asking the Apex team to give us some privacy. As they filed out, Marcus remained frozen in his chair, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Once the door closed behind the last Apex executive, Jessica turned to Marcus. "Is this true?" Her voice was deadly quiet. "It is not what it looks like." Marcus began, his tone defensive. "SecureStack is making baseless claims about code I developed independently." "Then why is this the first I'm hearing about a lawsuit?" Jessica demanded. "And why does Apex know about litigation involving my CTO before I do?" "It is a nuisance suit," Marcus insisted. "My lawyer advised keeping it quiet to avoid complicating the acquisition. He is handling it." Jessica turned to me. "Haley, explain exactly what you found and when." With all eyes on me, I methodically walked through my discovery process, showing the documentation I had compiled. I explained how I had found the comparison documents, the suspicious timing of the code commits, and Marcus' failure to disclose prior intellectual property. The technical similarities are beyond coincidence, I concluded. Based on my compliance experience, this represents a significant risk to our IP claims. The room fell silent as Jessica absorbed this information. Several board members who had joined for the acquisition signing exchanged concerned glances. "You had no right to access those files." Marcus suddenly erupted, pointing at me. "She broke company protocol by digging through development archives outside her clearance level. This is a witch hunt by someone angry about being marginalized during the acquisition process." Is that true, Haley? Jessica asked. Did you access restricted materials? I met her gaze steadily. All the materials I reviewed were accessible through my compliance credentials. Verifying the origin of our intellectual property is explicitly part of my job description. When I found concerning patterns, I had an obligation to investigate further. Before Marcus could respond, the door opened, and Diana from Apex re-entered, followed by their CEO. We apologize for the interruption, Diana said, but given the sensitive nature of what has been revealed, we believe it is important to address this promptly. Our technical team has reviewed the code comparisons Haley provided, and they confirm significant similarities with SecureStack proprietary technology. The Apex CEO nodded. We were already aware of the litigation against Mr. Reynolds, which is why we had our team specifically examine the authentication framework during due diligence. What concerns us is not just the potential IP infringement, but the failure to disclose this significant liability. Marcus stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You are taking the word of a compliance analyst with no technical expertise over mine. I built this technology from the ground up. Diana remained unruffled. Actually, we are basing our assessment on our own technical review, the documentation Haley provided, and the ongoing legal proceedings involving SecureStack. The evidence is compelling. Jessica took a deep breath, visibly processing this bombshell. What does this mean for the acquisition? That depends, the Apex CEO replied. We still believe in Novagen core business and technology outside the authentication framework. However, we would need to revise the terms to account for the potential liability and the cost of developing a replacement security layer. This is nonsense, Marcus interjected. You are using this as an excuse to slash the acquisition price. The authentication framework is a minor component of our overall platform. On the contrary, Diana countered. Security is fundamental to the value proposition, particularly given your customers in financial services and healthcare. The risk of using potentially infringing code in these regulated industries is substantial. Jessica held up her hand to silence further argument. Let us take a step back. What would you propose as a path forward? The Apex CEO exchanged glances with Diana before responding. We would need to exclude the authentication framework from the acquisition and reduce the purchase price accordingly. We would also require an indemnity clause protecting Apex from any liability related to past use of the disputed code. Our initial assessment suggests a revised offer of $120 million contingent on thorough code review to ensure no other components are affected. A collective gasp went through the room. $50 million had just evaporated from the deal. That is outrageous, Marcus protested. You cannot slash the value by nearly 30% over this. Marcus, enough, Jessica said firmly. She turned back to the Apex representatives. We will need time to discuss this privately and consult with our board. Of course, the Apex CEO agreed. We will give you the room. But I should note that our offer is time-sensitive. If we cannot reach agreement today, we will need to reconsider the entire acquisition. After they left, Jessica turned to address the stunned Novagen executives and board members. I need everyone except the board directors, Marcus and Haley, to step out, please. As the room cleared, I felt a wave of anxiety. I had done my duty by revealing what I had found, but I was now sitting in a room with people who might view me as the person who just cost them millions of dollars. Once we were alone, Jessica spoke directly to Marcus. I need the absolute truth right now. Does our authentication framework incorporate code from SecureStack? Marcus hesitated, then seemed to deflate slightly. There are similarities in approach, yes. But this is how software development works. We all build on what we have learned from previous projects. That is not what I asked, Jessica pressed. Did you copy code from SecureStack and implement it at Novagen without proper rights or disclosure? After a long pause, Marcus spoke quietly. I used my knowledge from previous work to quickly implement a solution Novagen desperately needed. The core concepts might be similar, but I rewrote everything for our platform. One of the board members, a seasoned technology investor named Richard Barnes, shook his head. That is still a derivative work under copyright law, Marcus. If you substantially based our authentication on SecureStack intellectual property without permission, we have a serious problem. Richard is right, Jessica said. And the bigger issue is that you hid this from us. even when directly asked about IP provenance. She turned to me. Haley, in your professional opinion, how serious is this situation? All eyes turned to me again. I chose my words carefully. Based on the evidence, I believe there is substantial risk that our authentication framework would be found to infringe on SecureStack intellectual property if challenged in court. The similarities are too extensive to be coincidental, and the timing of implementation shortly after Marcus joined suggests direct knowledge transfer. She is exaggerating the similarities, Marcus insisted. This could be argued either way in court. Which is precisely the problem, Richard interjected. Litigation over this would be costly, time-consuming, and public. Even if we eventually won, the damage to our reputation would be severe, particularly with security-conscious clients. Jessica nodded slowly, then turned back to me. Why did you bring this forward now, Haley? You must have known this could jeopardize the acquisition. I met her gaze directly. I discovered the evidence only 2 days ago. I tried to discuss it privately, with Marcus first, then left you a note this morning. My responsibility is to ensure Novagon complies with legal and ethical standards. Proceeding with the acquisition while knowingly misrepresenting our IP ownership would have been fraudulent. A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone absorbed the implications. Finally, Jessica spoke. Marcus, please wait outside. The board needs to discuss our options. Once he left, the conversation turned to damage control. Various options were debated, fighting Apex reduced offer, seeking other buyers, attempting to settle with SecureStack before proceeding. Throughout the discussion, I remained silent unless directly questioned. After about 30 minutes, Jessica turned to me. Thank you for your integrity, Haley. You can return to your desk now. Please keep everything that happened here strictly confidential. As I gathered my materials to leave, Richard spoke up. Actually, Jessica, I think Haley should stay. She understands the technical and compliance issues better than anyone else in the room, and we may need her input as we negotiate with Apex. Jessica considered this, then nodded. You are right. Haley, would you be willing to assist us through the remainder of this process? Of course, I replied, surprised but grateful for the validation of my professional judgment. What followed was the most intense 6 hours of my career as we worked through the implications of the IP issue, assessed our options, and ultimately returned to the negotiating table with Apex. Throughout it all, I provided documentation, answered questions about compliance requirements, and helped evaluate the risks of various approaches. By the end of that marathon session, a revised deal had been structured. Apex would acquire Novagon for $130 million contingent on a complete code review to ensure no other components contained problematic IP. Marcus would resign as part of the agreement, and Novagon would commit to replacing the authentication framework within 6 months. As the final documents were being prepared, Jessica pulled me aside. I owe you an apology, Haley. I should have listened when you raised concerns earlier. You were doing your job and doing it well. Thank you, I said simply. I was just trying to protect the company. You did, she assured me. What could have been a complete disaster or even fraud charges down the road has been turned into a manageable situation. The acquisition is still happening, just with appropriate adjustments for the reality of our IP position. As I left the conference room that evening, exhausted but relieved, I realized that my quiet persistence had not destroyed the acquisition after all. It had saved it from a much worse fate that would have eventually come to light. Sometimes the quietest person in the room truly does hold the power to change everything. The days following the revised acquisition agreement were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The news spread quickly throughout the company, though the official announcement was carefully crafted. Employees were told that the acquisition was proceeding at a reduced valuation due to intellectual property considerations requiring remediation. Most people understood this as corporate speak, for something was wrong with our code, but few knew the full story. Marcus was conspicuously absent. The official line was that he had decided to pursue other opportunities effective immediately. His desk was cleared out overnight, and security protocols were updated to revoke his access to all systems. The speed of his departure fueled speculation, but company leadership maintained a united front of discretion. I returned to my regular duties, trying to keep a low profile as the dust settled. But it was impossible to go completely unnoticed. People who had previously ignored me now smiled in the hallways or stopped by my desk to chat. Word had somehow spread that I had played a significant role in the acquisition negotiations, though the exact nature of my contribution remained unclear to most. Rachel caught up with me in the break room 3 days after the agreement. "So, compliance analyst extraordinaire, are you going to tell me what really happened in that meeting?" she asked, keeping her voice low. I gave her a small smile. "You know I cannot discuss confidential company matters." She laughed. "That is not a denial. The rumor mill is working overtime, you know. Some people are saying you saved the acquisition from falling apart completely. Others think you uncovered something that reduced the price. Care to set the record straight?" "The official announcement covers everything that can be shared," I replied diplomatically. "But I appreciate that people are suddenly interested in the importance of compliance work." Rachel studied me for a moment. "Well, whatever you did, things are changing around here. Jessica has called for a complete review of all our IP and compliance procedures, and there is talk about creating a new Chief Compliance Officer position reporting directly to her." That was news to me. I had been so focused on helping with the transition documentation that I had not heard about any organizational changes. Later that week, I received a calendar invitation for a private meeting with Jessica. When I arrived at her office, I was surprised to find several board members present as well, including Richard Barnes. "Haley, thank you for joining us." Jessica began once I was seated. "We have been discussing the events surrounding the acquisition and the valuable role you played in identifying the IP issue." Richard nodded. "Your thoroughness and integrity saved this company from what could have been a disastrous situation. Had the acquisition gone through without addressing the authentication framework issue, Apex would likely have discovered it during integration and could have pursued legal action for fraudulent representation." "I was just doing my job," I said, uncomfortable with the praise, but appreciative nonetheless. "That is exactly the point," Jessica replied. "You did your job exceptionally well, even when faced with opposition and attempts to marginalize your concerns." She exchanged glances with the board members before continuing. "Which brings us to the purpose of this meeting. We are creating a new executive position, Chief Compliance Officer, and we would like to offer you the role." I was momentarily speechless. I am honored, but are not there more experienced candidates you would want to consider?" Richard smiled. "We are not just looking for experience. We need someone with uncompromising integrity and the courage to stand up for what is right even when it is difficult. You have demonstrated those qualities under the most challenging circumstances." The offer included a substantial salary increase, equity in the company, which would convert to Apex equity after the acquisition, and a seat at the executive table. I would report directly to Jessica until the acquisition closed, then to the Apex Chief Legal Officer. "We need you to help us rebuild our compliance framework the right way," Jessica explained. "And after the acquisition, Apex wants you to lead the integration of compliance systems and help review all the code to ensure there are no other IP issues lurking." I accepted the position, still somewhat in disbelief at this turn of events. As I left the meeting, Jessica walked me to the door. "By the way," she said quietly, "the Apex CEO specifically mentioned how impressed they were with your professionalism during the crisis. They said it gave them confidence that Novagin still had a strong ethical core, despite the IP issue." The weeks that followed were intense, as we prepared for the acquisition closing. I built a small team to conduct a comprehensive review of all our intellectual property, bringing in technical experts to examine the codebase and legal specialists to analyze our licensing agreements. We discovered several other minor compliance issues, though nothing as serious as the authentication framework. Each finding was documented and addressed transparently, with Apex building trust that we were committed to resolving all problems before integration. Throughout this process, I occasionally wondered what had happened to Marcus. I got my answer about a month after his departure when Rachel forwarded me a news article. SecureStack had settled their lawsuit against him with terms undisclosed, but rumored to include a substantial payment and permanent restrictions on his use of certain technologies. "Guess you dodged a bullet by speaking up when you did," Rachel commented when we discussed it over lunch. "Imagine if this had blown up after the acquisition was completed." She was right. The timing of my discovery, while seemingly catastrophic in the moment, had actually been fortunate. It allowed us to address the issue before it became a liability that could have triggered fraud claims and regulatory investigations. The revised acquisition closed 6 months later, almost to the day from that fateful meeting. By then, we had completely replaced the authentication framework with a properly licensed alternative, documented all our intellectual property exhaustively, and established robust compliance procedures that became a model for other Apex acquisitions. At the closing dinner, the Apex CEO raised a toast to the Novagen team, who showed us that their integrity matched their innovation. He looked directly at me as he continued, "And to those who understand that good business and good ethics are not competitors, but essential partners." As I looked around the table at my colleagues, many of whom had initially seen me as an obstacle to their acquisition dreams, I realized how dramatically perspectives had shifted. The same people who had avoided me in the hallways now viewed my role as essential to the company's success. Jessica summed it up perfectly when she pulled me aside later that evening. "You know, Haley Marcus always thought the technical people were the only ones who really mattered. He never understood that in technology, trust is ultimately our most valuable product. You protected that when it mattered most." As the integration with Apex progressed, I found myself in a position of unexpected influence, helping to shape compliance policies across the combined organization. The acquisition that I had feared destroying had instead become a platform for positive change and for my own professional growth. The most meaningful moment came 3 months after the acquisition closed, when a junior compliance analyst on my team stopped by my office. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "For what?" I asked. "For showing that doing the right thing can actually work out in the end," she replied. "Most of my career I have been told to keep my head down and not make waves. It is refreshing to work somewhere that values speaking up." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that our actions create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate impact. By standing firm in my commitment to integrity, I had not only protected the company but also helped create an environment where others felt empowered to do the same. The quiet compliance analyst who had once been invisible had found her voice and used it to transform not just her own career, but the culture of an entire organization. 1 year after the acquisition, I stood at the podium during Apex Annual Compliance Summit, looking out at hundreds of faces from across the company. As the Chief Compliance Officer for the combined entity, I had been asked to share the Novagen integration story as a case study in ethical decision-making during corporate transitions. It was a surreal moment for someone who had once been relegated to the background, my concerns dismissed as irrelevant to the real work of technology development. Now, executives from across the organization had gathered to hear my perspective on building a culture of integrity. The past year had been transformative, both professionally and personally. After the acquisition closed, we completed a thorough audit of all Novagen intellectual property, identifying and resolving several minor issues before they could become problems. The authentication framework had been completely rebuilt with properly licensed technology, actually improving security in the process. Marcus had faded from the corporate landscape, his reputation damaged by the SecureStack settlement. Industry whispers suggested he had struggled to find another executive position as word of the IP issue had spread through informal networks. I took no pleasure in his difficulties, but recognized them as the natural consequence of his choices. Jessica had thrived in her new role as an Apex Division President, earning respect for her transparent handling of the acquisition complications. She had become one of my strongest allies, frequently citing the authentication framework incident as a pivotal learning experience in her leadership journey. It taught me to listen to every voice, she told me once, especially those who might see risks that others miss. On a personal level, the experience had transformed me from a cautious, sometimes hesitant professional into someone confident in standing by her principles. The anxiety that had once kept me awake at night when facing conflict had diminished, replaced by a quiet certainty in my own judgment. The Novagen acquisition taught us several critical lessons I explained to the audience at the summit. First, that compliance is not a checkbox exercise, but a fundamental business function that protects value. Second, that ethical shortcuts in technology, like in any field, eventually demand payment with interest. And third, that sometimes the most valuable contribution comes from someone willing to ask uncomfortable questions when everyone else is celebrating. After my presentation, a young compliance analyst from another Apex division approached me. "Your story resonates with me," she said. "I am dealing with a situation where I see potential problems, but everyone is rushing toward a deadline and does not want to hear about risks." "What is holding you back from speaking up more forcefully?" I asked. She looked down. "Fear, I guess. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being the person who ruins everything. Fear of standing alone." I nodded, recognizing my former self in her words. Those fears are valid. But ask yourself this, which would be worse? Rocking the boat now by raising legitimate concerns, or staying silent and watching a preventable problem damage the company later? "When you put it that way, the answer seems obvious," she replied. "The key is how you raise the issue," I advised. "Document thoroughly present facts rather than accusations, and always frame your concerns in terms of protecting the company, not challenging individuals. People might still resist initially, but you will have created a record of due diligence that will be valuable if problems emerge later." She thanked me earnestly, and as she walked away, I saw in her the beginning of the same journey. I had traveled a path from uncertainty to confidence, from fear to purpose. Back in my office after the summit, I found a small package on my desk. Inside was a polished glass award with my name engraved below the words, "Integrity in Action Award, Inaugural Recipient." A note from the Apex CEO explained that they had created this annual recognition in honor of my actions during the acquisition to be given to employees who demonstrated exceptional ethical leadership. I placed the award on my shelf, touched by the recognition, but more moved by what it represented. The validation that doing the right thing, even when difficult, was truly valued. It stood as a tangible reminder that one person standing firm in their convictions could indeed change an organization culture. That evening, I met Rachel for dinner to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the acquisition closing. She had been promoted to lead counsel for our division and remained one of my closest allies. "Did you ever imagine when you were digging through those code repositories late at night that you would end up here?" she asked as we toasted our new roles. I laughed. "Never. I was just trying to do my job properly and hoping not to get fired for it." "And instead, you fundamentally changed how an entire corporation views compliance," she said. Not bad for the quiet analyst who used to apologize for asking questions in meetings. Her observation made me reflect on how far I had come. I remembered the nervous woman who had once hidden in her cubicle, afraid to challenge the powerful CTO. That version of me seemed distant now, like a character in someone else's story. "The irony," I said, "is that Marcus always saw compliance as an obstacle to innovation, a bureaucratic function that just slowed things down. But in reality, good compliance is what allows innovation to create lasting value. Without it, you might build something impressive, but on a foundation that can collapse at any moment." Rachel raised her glass. "To building things that last on foundations of integrity." As I clinked my glass against hers, I thought about all the junior team members now looking to me for guidance. My greatest satisfaction came not from my title or compensation, but from creating an environment where ethical behavior was expected and valued, where people felt empowered to speak up when something was wrong. The next morning, I received an email from the young analyst I had spoken with after my presentation. She had raised her concerns with her manager, documented everything carefully, as I had suggested, and initiated a review that had indeed uncovered a significant compliance risk in a pending project. "Instead of being ostracized, I was thanked," she wrote. "My manager said she wished I had spoken up sooner. You were right about the approach making all the difference." Reading her message, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The ripple effects of that fateful discovery a year ago continued to spread, touching lives and shaping decisions far beyond anything I could have imagined. In the end, the quiet compliance analyst had not destroyed a $170 million acquisition. She had salvaged it by ensuring it proceeded on a foundation of truth rather than deception. And in doing so, she had transformed not just an acquisition but a corporate culture and herself. The greatest lesson I learned through it all was that integrity is not just a personal virtue, but a professional asset of immeasurable value. By standing firm in what I knew was right, even when it was difficult and frightening, I had not limited my career but elevated it beyond my wildest expectations. So to anyone watching this who feels unheard or undervalued in their organization, I want you to remember, your integrity is your power. Use it wisely, Stand by it courageously, and trust that doing the right thing, even when it seems costly in the moment, ultimately creates the most enduring value both for your organization and for yourself. If my story resonated with you, please share in the comments a time when you had to make a difficult ethical choice in your professional life. What gave you the courage to do the right thing? And if you found value in this journey, please like and subscribe for more stories about finding your voice and making it count. Thank you for joining me today, and remember, your quiet integrity might just be the most powerful force for change in your workplace.